Hello everyone, this is Ross Wozniak with Telerik, and in this video we'll take a look at populating the RAD TreeView with data from WCF RIA Services. Now I'll be showing this in the context of an application that I've developed in Silverlight 4 using the RAD controls for Silverlight 4 called TaskIt. What we'll do first is we'll take a look at the user interface and we'll see the RAD TreeView populated, and then we'll take a look at the code that we've used to populate it. So what I'll do is click into the tasks page. And you'll see over here on the left-hand side, we've got our tree view. So we've got 4 top-level nodes: categories, projects, contexts, and contacts. And under each of those, there are some child nodes. Now, the basic idea of this tree view on the left-hand side is that it's used to filter the tasks that are in the application. So right now, I'm looking at all of the tasks that are in the actions category, but I could look at all the tasks that are in the waiting category. I could look at all the tasks that are in, say, the TaskIt blog posts project, and even I could look at all categories. Now, in some cases, when you're populating your RAD TreeView, it's a pretty simple data load scenario. You've got all of the data coming from one table. So if you can imagine that you have a table that has a column called parent ID, what you could do is retrieve all the data from that table, and all of the records that have a parent ID of null would show up as top-level nodes. And then, say for instance, categories had an ID of 1, then these nodes underneath it would all be the ones that have a parent ID of 1. And let's say that projects had an ID of 2. These would be all the nodes that have a parent ID of 2. However, in the case of TaskIt, it's not quite that simple. The data that we're using to populate these nodes is actually coming from 4 different tables in the database. So everything from inbox down is coming from a table called task category. If I collapse up categories, you'll see that all these projects come from a table called project. All of these contexts come from a table called context, and all of these contacts naturally come from a table called contact. So now the question is, how did we get data from 4 different tables into a single RAD TreeView? So now let's take a look at the code. So now let's jump over to Visual Studio, and the place that we'll start is a class called TaskPageViewModel. And that class lives under the TaskIt Modules Tasks project inside a directory called ViewModels, and you can see here TaskPageViewModel. Now, TaskIt is an MVVM-based application, so I'm using view models behind all of my user controls. And this is actually the view model that lives behind the entire tasks page. So when the user first enters the tasks page, this view model class will be instantiated. And you see that in its constructor, the first thing it will do is call a method called loadData, and you can see that method right below here. So the first thing I do in load data is I get the current user ID because I'm going to need it here for a few of my calls to RIA services. And then what I'm going to do is call 5 different methods, 5 different calls via RIA services in order to get data. Now 4 of these, task categories, projects, contexts, and contacts, are going to be used in the RAD TreeView that we just saw. Priorities is not. That's something that I'm going to use elsewhere in the user interface. So you notice that it's calling dataprovider.getTaskCategories. So let's take a look at that. And you can see here that I've got an interface called iDataProvider. And this interface defines all of the methods that are used to obtain data for the TaskIt application. So you can see here that I've got getTaskCategories, getProjects, getContacts, and so forth. Now this class lives under the TaskIt project in a directory called core. You can see here iDataProvider. Now naturally I need a concrete implementation of that interface, and so I've got that in a class called dataProvider. And so as you can see here, once again, we've got our methods, getTaskCategories, getProjects, and so forth. So these are what are going to actually call back to the back end via RIA services. Okay, so let's go back to our test page view model. So we saw how we're going to call into these methods in our data provider in order to obtain our data. And when that data is returned, of course, it's going to make an asynchronous call to the back end. When that data is returned, we need a method to call back into on the user interface. So you can see here that when getTaskCategories is called, it's going to call onTaskCategories loaded when it completes. If we take a look at that, we'll see that the first thing that it does is check to see if there was an error obtaining the data. Now, if there was, we're going to display an error message to the user, and we're basically out of commission at this point, because if we couldn't load that data, then we can't really go any further in the task page. However, we'll assume that we're going to be able to load our data successfully, and it will call into a method called updateLoadCount. So let's go back to load data, and you'll see that we've got our three other methods here that we need to get data for the RIA TreeView: get projects, contexts, and contacts. Now these each take an additional parameter called current user ID. Now task categories are something that are global to Taskit. Every single user has the exact same task categories. However, when you go to get projects and contacts, you want to get just the ones that belong to that user that's logged in. So that's why we have to pass that additional parameter. And if we look at the callback method for get projects, we'll see that in onProjectsLoaded, it does pretty much the same thing as in onTaskCategories loaded. It checks to see if there's an error. If so, it displays an error message to the user, and basically we're out of business if this fails. And once again, it calls updateLoadCount if things are successful. And you can see here that for contexts and contacts that the code is exactly the same. All right, so now let's hit F5 to go into debug mode, and we'll step through this code. All right, so when my home page appears, I'll click into tasks, and we'll see here that our load data method has been called, and it's going to call get task categories. So let's move beyond that, and we'll see here that now we're actually on the back end. This is we're in our web project. You can see up here, Taskit Web Services Data Service. So this is our actual RIA service. So we're on the back end when we're retrieving all of the task categories. So all of the records that live in that task category table. If I continue to F5, it's going to call get contexts, and you can see that my user ID of 3 was passed in, and I'm going to use link here in order to say just give me the context where the user ID equals 3. Get projects will get called, and then get contacts. So now we made our 4 calls back to the back end in order to load our data. So the first thing that comes back is contexts. We've made 5 calls here for data, and because it's asynchronous, we have no idea in what order the data is going to be returned. So context was the first thing that came back. So you can see that it goes into update data load count. So if we step into that method, we have a member variable in our view model class called datasets loaded, and it's currently at 0. So if we go beyond that, naturally now we've incremented our datasets loaded to 1. And then we're going to check our data load count, and we'll see here if it equals 5, then we're going to do something, but it doesn't yet. So if I continue to hit F5, okay, so now we finally reached the point where all 5 data sets have loaded. And so what we're going to do is fire an event. Now this is using the MVVM Lite toolkit. I'm using its messenger class, and I'm going to fire an event that passes an instance of a class called DataLoadedArgs. And if I F5 beyond that, we'll see that in our TreeView model, so this is the view model that actually lives behind our red TreeView, I'm actually listening for this event here in the constructor. So when that constructor was called, it actually registered to listen for the DataLoadArgs event. And it calls into this method called onDataLoaded. So here in onDataLoaded, we're going to say, okay, we have now obtained all our data from the database that we need in order to populate the TreeView. Now we've got to actually assemble that data into a structure that we can use in order to bind to the item source of the RAD TreeView. So we're going to call into a method called getTreeViewData. If I go in there, you'll see here that this is where we're going to put all of our data together. So the first thing we're actually going to do is manufacture a task category entity. So this is a task category with an ID of 0 and the name of the task category is all categories. This is actually coming from a resix file. So that's the all categories node that we saw at the top of the child nodes under categories in our RAD TreeView. And then we're going to add all of the task categories that came back from RIA services to this task categories collection. So now our collection consists of one manufactured node that's called all categories, that's got an ID of 0, and then all of the other task categories that came back from the database. So that all categories node is a special node because when I click it, I'm going to pass the ID of 0, and that's basically going to say when I call back to the database to go off and get tasks for all categories, not just a specific category with a certain ID. All right, so now we've got our task categories. So now we're going to create a collection, a list of objects called TreeView data. And so we'll create an instance of an object called categories TreeView node. So this is once again a manufactured node that is going to be that categories node at the very top of our tree. If I go into this class, you see here that categories TreeView node inherits from task TreeView node base, which is right here above. And so it's got a property called name, which is a string. It's got an image, which is a URI, and then it's got a list of task categories called children. So here I'm going to create one of these nodes. The name is going to once again come from our resix file, and the string is going to be called categories. The image is going to be an icon that's called categories. And if we look over here under assets, images, icons, you can see that we have a bunch of icons here, and one of them is categories. So that's where it's going to get that from. And then it's got a children collection. That's our list of task categories. And so I'm going to assign task categories, which is what we built up here as the first thing in our method, as the children of that node. So now we have a categories node, and we've got a series of child nodes underneath it. Next, we're going to build a projects TreeView node, and that's going to pretty much follow the same pattern. Its children are going to be all of the projects that came back from our call to RIA services, same with contexts, same with contacts. So we've created 4 top-level nodes that all have a name property that comes from a resix file. We've told it what image to use, and then we've given it a collection of child objects that will be used for the nodes underneath it. So now I'll step out of this method, and you'll see here that the data structure that we just created is assigned to a property in our TreeView model called TreeView data. So if I move to the next line, you'll see that TreeView data now has a count of 4, so it's got 4 nodes, and those each have child nodes. So in summary, what we did was we made 5 calls off to the database via WCF RIA Services, and when all of that data was returned, we created a data structure that included some nodes that we manufactured on the client in our view models, and we combined that with some of the collections that came back from our RIA service calls in order to make a collection that we could bind to our TreeView. And if we take a quick look at our TreeView, we can see right here that its item source is bound to our property called TreeView data. So that's what we just saw in our view model. So at this point, we've determined how to load the data from WCF RIA services and present it in the RAD TreeView. But I encourage you to watch my next video where I talk about how to use the item template selector property of the RAD TreeView in order to determine how the nodes will actually look on screen.